Patton stood before the church and said nothing. The walls still held. The roof had caved inward upon itself. His officers recognized every variety of silence their commander possessed. The frozen silence that preceded the dismissal of a subordinate, the coiled silence before a major push. This silence belonged to neither category. This was the silence of a man who had just learned that 83 human beings, women and children among them, had been sealed inside this structure and burned alive, and that the officer who issued that order had described it upon his capture in the measured and detached vocabulary of a routine field operation. Patton had believed he grasped the nature of what he was fighting. He stood amid the wreckage of the village of Marsas in Alsace and understood that his comprehension had fallen catastrophically short. Marsas had been a small place before the war, the kind of settlement that exists by the thousands across rural France, anchored by a church, organized around a square, inhabited by families who had worked the same soil for generations. A community with that deep immovability of people who have not relocated in centuries. By the time Patton's soldiers reached it in the winter of 1944, it was no longer a village. It was a geometry of scorched walls and collapsed beams. And it carried that unmistakable hush of a place where something has occurred that the earth itself seems unable to absorb. The soldiers who first entered what was left of Marsas found survivors, few, but some. People who had concealed themselves in root cellars and forest hollows, and who crept out at the sound of American voices and American engines. People who had existed for months in that suspended condition known only to those who have witnessed total destruction, lived through it, and have not yet determined what living through it requires, or what follows. These survivors told the soldiers what had taken place. The soldiers relayed it upward through the chain of command. The report reached Patton. What the survivors described had unfolded in the summer of 1944. In the weeks after the Allied landings in Normandy, German occupation forces in Alsace had been executing what they termed security operations, a response to escalating French resistance activity across the region. The SS unit controlling the area had received intelligence, reliable or otherwise, that Marsas had been supplying aid to resistance fighters. The unit's commander, SS Oberführer Hinrich Brenner, reached a decision entirely consistent with the doctrine his men had been drilled to enforce. A decision that, measured against the norms of the Eastern Front, where most of these soldiers had previously served, registered as unremarkable. He assembled his unit and advanced on the village before dawn. He ordered the population gathered in the square. He separated the men from the women and children. The men, roughly 80 of them, ranging from boys of 16 to old men in their 70s, were marched to the edge of the village and shot. The women and children were forced into the church. The church was set ablaze. Those who attempted to climb through the windows were cut down by gunfire. Then the village itself was torched, methodically, structure by structure, until nothing remained that could shelter a partisan or serve as a base for further operations. The survivors were people who had not been present that morning. A farmer who had reached his fields at first light, seen the smoke climbing above the rooftops, and chosen concealment over return. A woman visiting relatives in a neighboring village who came back to find the absence of everything she had known. A 14-year-old boy sent on an errand the previous night, who had thrown himself into a roadside ditch at the first crack of gunfire and pressed his body into the mud for hours until the sound finally ceased. They had carried what they knew since summer. They had told no one, because there was no one to receive the telling. The German occupation authorities had no interest in their testimony. The neighboring villages understood what had happened and maintained the specific and forced quiet of communities that have been shown precisely what becomes of communities that are not quiet. And so the truth of what had been done at Marsas had survived in a tight orbit of witnesses and survivors, unwritten, unrecognized, invisible, until the soldiers of Patton's Third Army arrived, and the survivors finally had someone who would listen. Patton drove to Mazas himself. His staff had figured something out by this stage of the campaign. When reports like this arrived, Patton would drive out and see the evidence with his own eyes. There was no use arguing that a commanding general's time belonged elsewhere. He reached the village that morning in his staff car, his aide beside him, a small security detail trailing behind, and he walked through what was left of it. The survivors led the way. He said almost nothing during the walk. The officers with him had watched Patton in every kind of circumstance. They knew his silences the way they knew his speeches. Each kind of silence had its own texture, its own signal. But the silence he carried through the charred skeleton of Mazas was something none of them recognized. It was not the silence of a man holding back fury. That silence they understood well. This was the silence of a man taking in something that demanded every ounce of his attention to process. Something that was rewriting in real time his comprehension of what this war was and what it had always been from the very start. He stopped at the church. The walls still stood. The roof had buckled inward. Inside, nothing but collapsed timber, ash, ruin. Through an interpreter, the survivors told him what had taken place inside that church. He heard every word. He did not cut them short. He did not turn his gaze away. When they were done, he stood there for a long moment, just looking at the church. Then he said something, quietly, that his aide recorded on the spot. It appears in the official records of the Third Army from this period. He said he had believed he understood the enemy they were fighting. He said he had been wrong about how deep that understanding actually went. What had been done in this village was not a military action. It had never been conceived as a military action. It was something else entirely, something for which no term existed in the military vocabulary he had spent a lifetime constructing. And that absence of a word for it, that gap itself told him something. It told him how far beyond the boundaries of anything he had ever been trained to think about this thing actually reached. Then he asked for the name of the commander responsible. The survivors gave him what they had: the SS unit designation, a physical description of the officer who had issued the orders. A name some of them had overheard: Brenner, though none could say with certainty whether it was spelled correctly, whether it was a first name or a surname, or whether it was a name at all rather than something else entirely. Patton turned to his intelligence staff and gave them direct instructions. Finding the commander responsible for Mazas was now an intelligence priority. He wanted everything that could be uncovered: the unit, its movements since the summer, its current position, and the identity and whereabouts of its commanding officer. He made a distinction. He was not pursuing this information for the purpose of military prosecution. That process would move through proper channels after the war ended. He wanted it because understanding what had been carried out, who had carried it out, and how it had been possible, that was knowledge the army required in order to grasp what it was truly fighting. Then he said something else. He said every soldier in the Third Army needed to understand that Mazas was not an aberration. It was not the work of a single criminal unit that had exceeded what its superiors intended or approved. It was the logical conclusion of a system engineered to produce precisely this kind of outcome. And the men fighting that system needed to see what they were fighting, with absolute clarity. No euphemism, no comfortable distance created by ignorance of what the system actually did when it functioned exactly as designed. He said he would make certain the soldiers of the Third Army learned about Mazas. Not as a propaganda exercise, not to manufacture rage that would sharpen their fighting edge, though rage would come, and they would fight harder. But because soldiers who truly understood their enemy fought differently than soldiers operating on abstractions. And the men who had fallen in the fields outside this village, the women and children who had perished inside this church, deserved to be known by the very men whose purpose it was to ensure that the people who murdered them were destroyed. The intelligence effort launched after Patton's visit to Mazas delivered results within weeks. The unit was identified, its movements traced through the fog of retreat. And amid the unraveling chaos of German forces pulling back through Alsace in the winter of 1944, bleeding into 1945, Brenner and his command drifted directly into the path of the Third Army's advance. He was taken into custody in February of 1945. They brought him to a Third Army interrogation facility. American intelligence officers questioned him with a JAG officer seated in the room, his sole purpose being to ensure that every word extracted could hold weight in future legal proceedings. Patton himself was not in that room. He had a war to wage. The interrogation of prisoners, even prisoners carrying this kind of weight, did not demand his physical presence. But the report found its way to his desk, and that report was thorough. What it laid out was a precise, almost surgical portrait of a man recounting what he had done, recounting it within the framework of a formal military interrogation, conducted by the army that had broken him. Brenner spoke in the measured cadence of a man performing a calculation. Cooperation might yield softer consequences than defiance. That was the math behind every answer he gave. He did not deny what had taken place at Mazas. He framed it in the vocabulary of military necessity, deploying the security doctrine language drilled into him through years of training. The population, he said, had rendered material support to illegal combatants. His actions fell within the boundaries of his orders, consistent with the operational demands of his command, cold, methodical. He described the killing of men in the fields and the deaths of women and children inside the church using the exact same register he used when discussing supply routes and troop movements. When this interrogation report reached Patton, he read every page. Then he composed a written response to his intelligence staff, a response that was also preserved within Third Army records. He stated that the interrogation confirmed everything necessary for legal purposes. The material was to be preserved and forwarded to the proper authorities for prosecution once the war ended. He stated that Brenner was to be held under secure custody and treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Because the United States Army applied the Geneva Convention to all prisoners, regardless of what those prisoners had done. The extension of that protection to a man like Brenner was not a personal courtesy. It was a standard the Army upheld for its own reasons. Reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with whether the prisoner was deserving. Then Patton wrote something else. He wrote that he had read Brenner's account of the events at Mazas, and that the clinical exactness of the telling disturbed him in ways that fury or guilt never could have. Because it exposed something about the machinery that had manufactured Brenner. Something that raw criminal brutality alone would never have revealed. Brenner had not lost control. He had not deviated from his training. He had executed it precisely, faithfully. He had done exactly what the system he served had engineered him to do. And that, Patton wrote, was the thing that demanded understanding about this enemy. Not that it spawned aberrations who raged beyond human boundaries, but that it forged men who had been methodically conditioned to classify the slaughter at Mazas as a routine military operation. He wrote that this was the true adversary, not individual wickedness, though individual wickedness saturated every corner of it, but a system that had industrialized evil itself. A system that erected the architecture, designed the training, codified the doctrine to ensure Mazas was never an anomaly. It was standard operating procedure. And dismantling that system, was what the war was genuinely about. The bedrock beneath every strategic calculation, every supply chain, every operational blueprint. The reason all of it carried meaning. He wrote that he hoped the men tasked with the post-war reckoning grasped this. He wrote that punishing individual perpetrators was both necessary and just, but it was not enough. What the moment demanded was an accounting that penetrated the system itself, the doctrine, the training apparatus, the command hierarchies that had made Marsas achievable. And if the post-war tribunals failed to reach that depth, they would have failed at the one thing that actually needed doing. He wrote that he held little optimism they would reach that standard. The processes taking shape were being designed by lawyers, by diplomats, by politicians, men who grasped individual criminal responsibility with precision, but who understood systemic accountability far less clearly. That gap between what the moment demanded and what the machinery of justice was likely to deliver, he found it deeply troubling. The post-war trials at Nuremberg turned out more sophisticated than Patton had feared. The concept of crimes against humanity, the prosecution of commanders for the acts carried out by their units, the effort to hold the system itself accountable by prosecuting the men who had built it, who had run it. These were genuine attempts to accomplish the very thing Patton had laid out in his report. Whether they fully succeeded is a question historians and legal scholars have fought over ever since. Brenner stood trial after the war. Evidence drawn from the Third Army interrogation formed part of the case against him. He was convicted. The sentence matched what had been done at Marsas, which is to say, no sentence could ever truly match what had been done at Marsas. No punishment a court could hand down would ever achieve that. But it was what the law was capable of producing, and it was produced. Patton never saw the trials. He died in December 1945, 7 months before the Nuremberg verdicts came down. He had written what he believed needed writing. He had spoken what he believed needed speaking. And the processes he had fed with evidence, with testimony, with the weight of what he had witnessed. Those processes moved forward without him. The village of Marsas was rebuilt after the war. The church was reconstructed. A memorial was placed at the site where the men had been shot. Another was set inside the rebuilt church for the women and children. The memorial carries every name. 83 names carved into stone in a village in Alsace that most people have never heard of. A village that soldiers of Patton's Third Army discovered in the winter of 1944 as nothing more than burned walls, collapsed roofs, and that particular silence, the silence of a place that had been shown what the system they were fighting actually did when it operated exactly as designed. Patton had walked through that silence, and he had understood something that altered his comprehension of the entire war. He wrote it down in a report preserved within the Third Army records. He had said, "The soldiers needed to know." In the winter and spring of 1945, as the Third Army drove east, and the full magnitude of what the system had produced revealed itself, not only in burned villages, but in the camps, in the mass graves, in the meticulous documentation of industrial murder that advancing armies uncovered across Germany, the soldiers knew. They knew precisely what they had been fighting, and they finished the job.